all you valiant soldiers, a story I will tell about the bloody battle that was fought on Shiloh's hill. It was an awful struggle.
Tonight, that's not going to be a ghoul. Everybody you'll see giving a speech is going to be part of the living dead. I'm quite alive, for better or for worse. The reason I give you my name, I want to let you know that I am the president of an organization called the Battle of Nashville Preservation Society. We have a little booth over here. It's kind of hard to see at night, but after I finish my little spiel, if y'all can drop by and visit the booth, we'd deeply appreciate it. I'm here really for a couple of reasons, one of which, of course, is to tell you about the Battle of Nashville Preservation Society, but more importantly, probably to tell you about the sites, what we're trying to do with the society. One of the sites we're deeply interested in and enjoy preserving is the one we're all standing here. Although the society doesn't preserve it, we support all preservation efforts of Civil War monuments and sites. Now where we're standing is the Confederate Circle. I don't know if y'all have been on the tour before or not. If so, then you've probably heard this before, but if you haven't, this is quite an interesting place where we're standing. It's hard to see here, but if you look over behind us, you'll see these lights running all around us here. And that marks out the perimeter of the circle. Inside the circle are buried 1,500 Confederate dead. There are few places like this as well preserved and in good order. This is one of them. We're honored to have that here in the city. Most of the dead were buried not just after the Battle of Nashville, but after the war itself. A lot of the names that you can see, and you might be able to do this after we're through chatting a bit, have names marked showing date of birth and date of death. And most of the deaths here, 1864, 1865. If you're familiar with the Battle of Nashville, you know that it took place at the end of the war and not at the beginning. It took place in December 15th, 16th, 1864. The Union had occupied the city for a number of years after the fall of Fort Donelson in February of 1862, and it erected over 26 miles of entrenchments and forts around the city to protect it from what they called the invading Southern Army. How you invade your own land, I don't know. But at the end of towards the end of the war, Hood, after the fall of Atlanta, decided to march on to Nashville to try to take it, with the hope of gathering all the supplies here in the city and either going north through Kentucky and possibly making raids into Ohio and Indiana, but probably more importantly and more logically, to move into the east to help fight with Lee in Virginia, to hold there. And if he had been successful there, who knows what would have happened. Would the South have won the war? Don't know, hard to say. But we do know what did happen. What happened here was Hood was crushed, his army was defeated, he was outnumbered 3-1. After the fall of the city of Nashville, or after the defeat, I should say, of the Confederates here in the city of Nashville, the war was over for the Confederacy. And many historians believe that the war really took place, and the most important part of the war, I should say, took place here in the West. With the West lost, the war was lost. And once the war was lost in the West, the Army of Tennessee really existed no more. This was the last battle in which two armies clashed during that War between the states. Others were skirmishes in the East, but no standing battle of two great armies here on an open battlefield. A lot of historians also believe that what really happened here in Nashville is what happened in parallel in Japan in 1945. What we suffered here was like the Hiroshima or the Nagasaki of the Civil War. This is where a nation was destroyed and an army was obliterated and the people were crushed. Now that's why we should remember this, but that's probably unfortunately why a lot of people don't remember the Battle of Nashville, because it was such a crushing defeat for those who suffered through it. That's one reason why the great sites we have across the city are not kept well. That's one reason we're trying to go back and try to keep them well. We want to keep the memory of the past important. It's important to keep the past alive. Faulkner said the past isn't dead, the past is not even the past. Others have said the past is the parent of us all, and without knowing your past, you really don't know who you are. So it's important for us, as y'all are here tonight, to remember that past. It's our precious treasure. It's what separates us from every other species in the world. We have a past. Now, part of the past we're trying to preserve is Shiloh Hill. If you're familiar with the Battle of Shiloh Hill, it is the most important site remains of the battle. We're also trying to save Redoubt Number 1. Redoubt 1 is located near Hillsborough and Woodmont Boulevard. It's an old redoubt, for y'all don't know, it's a fort. It's an old earthen fort. It was built by the Confederates while they were anticipating a fight with the Yankees during the battle. It still stands. It's about 75 feet long and about 2 or 3 feet high. If you have a minute, go by and we have some pictures of it. I'd like y'all to look at it. But what we really like y'all to do is join our organization. When y'all walk out of here, you're going to remember a pleasant evening. But what we really want you to do is remember and build for a pleasant future. And by saving these sites, we think it's good not only for the community, maybe a little tourism on the side, but it's educational too. It helps your children, who really have less and less understanding of the past, have something alive and it's tangible. I cannot go through Green Hills without being spooked, knowing that the Battle of Nashville took place there. And knowing these things brings your city alive and gives you a great deal more pride in who you are and where you're from. Anyway, if y'all have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them for you. I hope you can join our organization. I hope you have a good tour tonight. And thanks for coming out tonight. Don't freeze. Any questions? Well, let me mention one other thing. We're working with the city to try to put together a driving tour for our battle sites. There's so many sites remaining. We got about 44 that we've been able to identify. We used to be able to sell some maps over here. We're not doing that now. We ran out of maps. But we want to be able to put together a good driving tour so you can go out and see these sites and bring them alive. One of the great sites that we do have that's not being used is Fort Negley. We hope Fort Negley is erected soon, is reestablished, I should say, and becomes a great tourist site for us all. This is an interesting site, but it's hard to get to. Do y'all know where Fort Negley is? Everybody know where it is? Do everybody know what I'm talking about, Fort Negley? It was one of the Union forts built during the occupation. And a lot of it's decimated, but a lot of it still remains. And we think if we could make that an attractive tourist site, we really have something good for the city. Well,
do y'all have a website?
Yes, we do. What's our website? I think it's www.bonps.org. That sounds good.
What was it?
No, we have some copies of our website that we can give you, and that's free. Go by the booth and we'll hand that out to you. But it's www.bonps, Battle of Nashville Preservation Society.org. And I'm computer illiterate. I kind of live in the 19th century. Kind of like it back there. That's right. So I have a hard time getting into the 21st. But y'all welcome to the 21st century and join us on our website. Hope y'all.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to welcome you here tonight. My name is Adelicia Hayes Franklin Ackland Cheatham. I'd like to introduce you to my first husband, Mr. Isaac Franklin, and to my second husband, Mr. Joseph Ackland.
Good evening.
Now, if you've been with us in times past, we're going to diverge a bit from our usual discussions and talk with you tonight a little bit about the events and the politics that touched our lives before and during the war between the states. Isaac, since you're the eldest, would you like to start?
Certainly, dear. I was born in Sumner County in 1789, only 13 years following the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was then that the seeds of the war were probably sown, and no, the issue was not slavery. There were abolitionists in both the North and the South, as well as slave traders. The signing of the Declaration of Independence actually laid the foundation for secession by allowing states the rights to abolish any form of government that they found oppressive or destructive. At the time of the Declaration of Independence, northern colonies wanted a strong central government. Southern colonies, on the other hand, well, we feared a strong central government would take away our right to govern ourselves, and there were some northern colonies that agreed with that position. Like many people of my time, born on the frontier, I had very little formal education. At an early age, I was involved in business with my brothers. Later, admittedly, I was a slave trader. However, by the 1830s, the importation of slave labor became illegal, but the internal market remained legal. After meeting Adelicia, I renounced my association with the trade. You see, her father would have never allowed her to marry a slave trader.
This is very true. You see, my father was a lawyer and a Presbyterian minister. An interesting combination, I understand, by your modern standards.
I became a very wealthy landowner, owning Fairview Plantation in Gallatin, which was our summer home, and plantations in Louisiana, which produced cotton.
In 1846, Isaac died in Louisiana, and a month later, our two youngest daughters also died. I brought my eldest daughter, Emma, back to Nashville, where I purchased a home. And a year later, I met Mr. Joseph Ackland, a lawyer from Huntsville, Alabama. 2 years later, we were married.
A lawyer?
Slave trader.
Gentlemen, this is not the time or the place for that.
He does this every year.
Joseph, why don't you continue the story, please?
Thank you, my dear. Well, Mr. Franklin, I apologize.
Likewise.
Now, before I married Adelecia, I signed a prenuptial agreement that would protect her wealth.
Very well done, dear. No, he was a lawyer.
You see, yes, back in the 19th century, women did not manage their own business affairs, so I assumed that responsibility for her. And if I might say so, I think I did it rather well, because our wealth truly did increase. I'll be the first to admit that I never really had much stomach for slave labor, but it was simply a fact of our lives in those days. I was, however, quite proud of an article that was written about me that appeared in the Southern Cultivator magazine back in 1852. In this article, I was commended for the care and treatment of our slaves on our Louisiana plantations. Now, years prior to the outbreak of the war, tensions had run very high between the North and the South. During the 1860 presidential election, Lincoln and the Republican Party had failed to gain a popular majority, but they did win, however, in the Electoral College. Now, much of the South at that time was Democratic and under Democratic leadership. Many of those men were seen as revolutionaries and not really part of our legal government. Lincoln wanted desperately to preserve a strong federal presence in these states in order to rescue them. Southerners in South Carolina, when they saw Yankee troops stationed at Fort Sumter, they looked upon them as being foreign troops, and they ordered them to surrender. When they refused, South Carolina troops opened fire. Now, Tennessee, as well as other southern states, even refused to allow federal troops to cross their borders in order to aid Fort Sumter. Lincoln even went so far as he did to demand that us Tennesseans supply him with federal troops, and we also refused that one too. Now, as Isaac has alluded to earlier, slavery was not really part of the war until the second half, as far as being a real issue. The United States government at that time was so desperately trying to preserve the Union that it felt in order to achieve this, it had to have a good plan. And that plan was to defeat the Confederate cause, to attack us on our own land. As Southerners, on the other hand, they simply set about trying to defend their land and exercising their rights as they saw that the Constitution had given them.
The United States government felt that if it could not defeat the Southerners' will to fight, it would defeat their ability to do so. The Anaconda Plan was implemented to achieve this end. It involved blockades and invasion. The whole idea was to keep the battlefields in the South and wear down the citizenry. The plan worked quite well. As the war drug on, the Southerners became very war-weary.
Only about 10% of all the folks in the South owned any slaves. Out of this 10%, 1% of them owned 90% of all the slaves. So as you can see, most Southern people were not slaveholders. They were simply just simple folk trying to survive the war.
In 1863, Joseph also died on the plantations in Louisiana. This was the same year that Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation carried with it the avowed purpose of punishing slaveholders in the states in rebellion. Now, since we lived in Tennessee, and Tennessee was under the control of the United States government, we were not included in the Emancipation Proclamation, nor were many counties in the states of Louisiana and Virginia. slavery was not abolished in the United States until December of 1865 by an act of Congress. Many slaves escaped and went to the North. Many joined the Union Army. Many stayed in the South, and believe it or not, the Confederate Army was biracial. South was their home too. In December of 1864, the battle for Nashville was fought, and Belmont, our home estate, was caught in the battle lines. Now, I took my family and went into downtown Nashville to the home of Mrs. James K. Polk, wife of a former United States president, and rode out the battle there. I believed, and rightfully so, that we would be safe there. When I returned to Belmont, though, the estate had suffered severe damage, and I sued the federal government for my losses after the war. I didn't live to collect. You know how the government works. But believe it or not, my son did collect for those damages. We've tried tonight very briefly and very simplistically to relate to you the events that shaped the time in which we lived and the war that was the defining event of that time period. We thank you for coming tonight. We hope you enjoy the rest of the tour and the people you're going to meet along the way. Thank you so much for coming, and do try to stay warm.
This thing takes snapshots too.
They're on their way.
They're on
Okay.
the way now. This is number 20.
Well, I'll begin by telling you that I am Timothy Lanier of Colquitt County, Georgia, which is in southern Georgia, right close to Florida. And I'll tell you, it's a beautiful place. Pine trees there seem to touch the sky, and you can grow just about any crop there, or fruit tree. We always had real good things to eat at home, and my growling stomach reminded me of that when I was in the Army. But my trouble's over for right now, so I'll move on. I bet you're wondering how I got into the Army at age 15. Let's just say I stretched the truth a little bit. We Georgians loved our state, and we were willing to do a lot for it and for our freedom. Now, we seceded from England because we felt we didn't have a voice. When Lincoln was elected to office as president, we saw that once again we were going to be denied a voice. So we left. It's funny, I don't recall ever hearing someone tell me that they voted for Lincoln. Breckenridge carried Georgia, and Nashville's own John Bell over there carried just about everything else because he came in second. They never would have invaded another state or started a war. But Lincoln did, so we fought him. We paid a terrible price for it.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sergeant Michael Krantz from over in Cheatham County. Now, my friend here would have you believe that Georgia is the center of the universe.
Ah, yes.
But I submit to you today that Middle Tennessee is the dimple of the universe, and that if it wasn't for Tennessee, Georgia would have never been able to fight the war as long as we did. Anyway, that's another discussion. We'll talk about that later, but I heard recently that there was a number of Georgians called Bulldogs that went up into East Tennessee, and they fought some sort of contest in a coliseum called Neyland Stadium. And in that place, evidently the Tennessee Volunteers, as they're called,
Must be some militia unit.
I guess so, some sort of militia, must have beaten them up pretty badly. Georgia was sent home, I'm afraid, in defeat. But,
Leave it up to a Tennessean's ego.
But anyway, we'll discuss this later. Let us tell you a little bit more about our lives. I grew up in Cheatham County on a farm. I had 4 brothers and 4 sisters. And we did well for a family that size. We always provided for ourselves. We never had any slaves. We knew of people that did, but we never actually owned any. We weren't really involved too much politically either. But when it became apparent that Lincoln was to send his army into the South, then we got involved. I joined the Army in the fall of 1861. I enlisted in the 49th Tennessee. In February of 1862, we found ourselves up near Clarksville, west of there actually, at a place called Fort Donelson, up the Cumberland River from here. We held off the Federal Army as long as we could, and our cannons beat up on the Yankee gunboats, but it was not nearly enough. And a crazy general up there, Confederate general, decided to surrender us. We were all taken as prisoners. We were sent by way of railroad cars up north to a prison camp near Chicago called Camp Douglas. We nearly froze to death, as you might imagine. There are 6,000 Confederates that never came back from Camp Douglas. They're buried there still today.
You know, I've been thinking about that particular subject. And I looked around here, and it's a pretty place. I wish I was buried at home in a nice Georgia hill, but I guess a Tennessee hill would come second to that. A lot of people weren't so lucky. I had one brother who died of typhoid fever early in the war, and my brother found him and took him home and buried him in our family cemetery. I had another brother in Virginia fighting in Robert Lee's army. He was killed sometime, we don't know how or exactly when, because we learned about this months later. But we wrote our mother and told her that he was killed. And she grieved a lot for him, since we didn't know anything about how he died. But in that letter home, John wrote that we were tired and we were hungry, but we aren't stopping, because we are fighting for our freedom. And once we've won it, it will be that much dearer to us. So we continued on, but things only got worse. I had another brother fighting in Georgia who lost an arm, or at least he got home. So me and John found ourselves in a place called Franklin, Tennessee. It was there we lined up to do battle with the Federal Army. We lined up there and looked across the field. It was a 2-mile field, and we saw that they numbered about 4 times what we numbered, and they were in trenches. But some general thought it'd be a smart idea to charge them. Well, I'm almost a living testament that that was not a good idea. And we charged the field because we did have the honor to follow orders. About halfway down the field, John stepped in front of me and received a cannonball in the head. I continued on and made it to the trenches, where I was hit by a mini ball and fell into the trench. A lot of people fell on top of me, and the blood was so deep there I almost drowned in it.
I was at Franklin too, and it was a slaughter. We left a large number of men dead on the battlefield. We also lost 12 generals. The army was totally demoralized. The Yankee army retreated to Nashville. We soon pursued, but it was our army that should have retreated. The early part of December, there was a winter storm. It was very, very cold, and that delayed any fighting. On or about December 15th and 16th, a big battle was finally fought here at Nashville. Our regiment found ourselves over along the Hillsborough Pike in an earthen fortification called Redoubt No. 5. When I saw that our pickets were coming in fast, I knew that we were in trouble. We were loading and firing as fast as we could, but we were outnumbered a great deal. We were finally overrun by the Federals and taken prisoner. I proceeded to tell them, our captors, that there were more Yankees dead on the field than Confederates. Well, as you might imagine, they didn't like that. And one of them yelled, "You'll not live to tell it," and stabbed me right in the chest with his bayonet. It was an agonizing and bitter death. Before I died, I saw to it that a Bible like this one was to be given to my mother as a memento of me. Many men died on that day, many of which are buried in this beautiful place. We were fighting for our homes and firesides.
But in December of 1864, it was mostly the firesides.
Yes. We were fighting for a cause in which we believed.
First thing you need to know is that it was politics that helped drive me to this grave. You're probably asking yourself, who in the world is John Bell? Well, amongst other things, I ran for President of the United States against Abraham Lincoln. And I am firmly convinced, had I been elected, there would have been no war. permit me to tell you a little bit about myself. I, like many of you, trace my family roots back to North Carolina. My grandfather settled here in 1783. He fathered 19 children. I was born in 1796. I grew up out off Nolensville Pike, and I wasn't that different from the rest of the kids when I was growing up. I just didn't enjoy hunting and fishing quite as much as some of them. I really preferred to read and to think. I went to Cumberland College. It was 1812 and the war was just ending, and the nation, which was very little older than I at that point, was so filled with itself, so filled with pride about standing up to the British the way they had, and the South was flushed with a sense of nationalism. 2 years after college, I decided to make a run for the state senate. Now, frankly, I probably should have run from it, as it turned out to be a most difficult, long career in politics for me. The state capital in those days was in Knoxville. There wasn't any West Tennessee. There was no Memphis. Nashville was the far west. This was the frontier. Beyond that, it was just Indians. I believed that we needed to have strong colleges and that the state should participate in the funding of them. It was funding issues that led me in 1826 to make a run for the United States Congress. I defeated a man by the name of Felix Grundy, who, by the way, is buried right there, just across the road. It was largely the vote of the white aristocracy here in Nashville and the free blacks in the area that got me elected. Perhaps you were unaware of the fact that fully a fourth of all the blacks in this area at that time were free. Why, they even sent a band over to serenade me after the election. I thought that was wonderful. I enjoyed it. In Congress, I felt we strictly had to operate from a balanced budget. We should take care of debts and obligations first, and then if there was any surplus, then that money could be applied to roads and to schools. But the Congress was not to make those decisions, for any surplus funds that came about should be going back to the states from whence they came. It's a very difficult thing to help people understand that internal improvements are supposed to be outside the pale of congressional authority. In a speech before Congress in 1829, related to the Cumberland Road Bill, I tried to help them understand that the U.S. Constitution does not give Congress the authority to establish a system of roads. Somebody posed as a question, well, what if the states give the right-of-way? I said, no, sir. A state cannot add to the power of the general government. The problem looked obvious to me. If you did that, folks would begin to look to the general government as a source of money for funding. And the general government would become everything and the states would become nothing. By 1832, it was pretty obvious that we had a very hungry general government on our hands. We didn't have any income tax. Mr. Lincoln and his Yankee friends would take care of that in due time. Our primary sources of funding came from things like tariffs. There was also a jealousy issue involved. The northern manufacturing states were so jealous of the South because of our great success in trading with Europe. South Carolina was the first state to nullify the tax laws. President Andrew Jackson had to threaten them. But a compromise was reached of sorts. It basically was just simply lowering the level of the tariff involved. But that did manage to keep things quiet. But frankly, had it not been for cooler heads like Mr. Calhoun and Mr. Henry Clay, South Carolina would have seceded from the Union right then in 1832. Nearly 3 decades later, these issues and a lot of other constitutional issues still remain unresolved, and that's when I made the decision to run for the presidency. I carried 3 states, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. Mr. Breckinridge carried the rest of the South, and Mr. Lincoln carried the North. Abraham Lincoln's name was not even on the ballot in the South. I was very concerned that this extremely regional candidacy of his, a sectional candidacy like that, would play right into the hands of the problem of secession. My firm opinion that Abraham Lincoln was chosen with a callous disregard for the possible consequences to this nation. Mr. Lincoln himself had said in Congress in 1847 that any nation, anywhere, anytime has a right to rise up and throw off the government, a government that's not to their liking, and to establish a new one that is to their liking. Well, the South took his advice. The first state to secede was South Carolina. Then came the states to the south of us, right across the Gulf, from Florida to Texas. In February of '61, Tennessee voted to remain in the United States. You see, we believe that secession was totally legal and they were all within their rights. We just weren't quite as upset with everything as the rest of them were. The next month, in March of '61, I made my way to Washington City to attend Mr. Lincoln's inauguration. And while I was there, I had a meeting with Mr. Lincoln in which I advised him that I thought caution was the best road to take and that, frankly, he should just let the states go in peace. And I came back to Tennessee completely convinced that he was going to take a pacifistic approach to the situation. Only to find out later that all the while behind the scenes he was conniving to strengthen and to reinforce the troops related to Fort Sumter. South Carolina waited for 5 months after secession before she finally lost her patience and opened fire. Now, Tennessee at that point was still a member of the United States. And we were greatly concerned when we heard what had happened, but we were not the least bit surprised because we felt that Mr. Lincoln had perpetrated the whole situation. When news came from Mr. Lincoln finally that he expected the state of Tennessee to provide troops to invade the Confederacy, that did it. I'd never seen anything like it. Attitudes changed completely overnight. You see, Tennessee had voluntarily become a part of this compact known as the United States. So Governor Harris sent back word to Mr. Lincoln to say, Tennessee will not provide one man for the purposes of coercion. Tennessee seceded from the Union, and we felt we had every right to do so. Maybe your understanding would be a little better if I made a quotation from Mr. Robert E. Lee related to how we thought about things at that particular point. He said, "A union held together by a bayonet holds no charm for me." I thank you for dropping in. Good night, enjoy your tour.
Good evening. I'm Celine Harding Jackson. My grandfather, John Harding, came to Nashville from Virginia over 200 years ago. At that time, there were only about 300 people living here. He built his home out along the old Natchez Trace, calling it Belle Meade, which means beautiful meadow in French. In 1853, my father, William Giles Harding, along with the assistance of an architect by the name of Adolphus Hyman, added on to our home, and they say Belle Meade's as beautiful today as it was when we lived there. My mother was Elizabeth McGavick. Her childhood home was Carton Plantation over in Franklin. Carton was actually named after her father's ancestral home in Ireland. My cousin's home, Two Rivers Mansion, is also still standing. That's out on McGavick Pike. They started building that home when I was a baby. They actually made an impression of my foot in one of the newly formed bricks. It was later placed on the back porch along with my nickname, Lena. Our families and our homes are very dear to us. But as Tennesseans, we felt we had done nothing to bring on the war. Once Lincoln ordered our troops to invade the Confederacy, once Lincoln ordered our troops to invade the Confederacy, we had no choice but to secede. We never dreamed the Yankees would find their way to Nashville. But once Fort Donelson fell, they sailed their gunboats right up the Cumberland River. Nashville fell early in 1862. Although my father was too old to fight, he was able to pay for and organize the Harding Light Artillery. He had also contributed an awful lot of money to the Confederacy. So it wasn't long before the Yankees came to arrest him. I'll never forget that day. Those Yankees rode in and they were immediately surrounded by most of our slaves. The slaves were carrying field tools, axes, some of them even had guns. They weren't about to let Father be arrested. But rather than cause more problems, he sent them back to the fields. And he was arrested. He was sent to Michigan, where he served 6 months in prison. He was released only after paying $20,000 in gold and promising he would no longer aid the Confederacy. Those 6 months were very hard on Mother. She had to run the plantation all by herself. I remember her asking Miss Susanna McGavick Carter, she was our most loved and trusted house servant. Well, she asked Miss Susanna to hide all of the family silver. She was afraid it might be stolen. She trusted her so much she never even asked her where it was hidden. And after the war, Miss Susanna went and retrieved it. Every single piece was still there. At some point, somebody did ask her about her hiding place, and she wouldn't tell them where it was. The only thing she would say was that it was not amongst the living. I remember my sister, Mary Elizabeth, hearing a commotion out on the front lawn. She ran out to the porch and saw a Yankee chasing one of our turkeys all over the yard. And mind you, the Yankees had already stolen just about everything there was to steal. They'd taken all of the deer and buffalo from the deer park, all of the chickens and turkeys, most of the grains. There really wasn't much else. Somehow that turkey had managed to escape an earlier demise. He made his way up to the front porch. Mary Elizabeth was standing there. She lifted up her hoop skirt and tucked that turkey right underneath. That old Yankee didn't know what to do. He just stood there staring at her as if she had completely lost her mind. Needless to say, the turkey lived to see another sunrise. That last winter of the war was the worst. November 30th, 1864, Battle of Franklin. 5 hours, 6,000 Confederate casualties, 3,000 Union casualties. The bodies of 4 of our finest Confederate generals lay unstate on the back porch of my mother's home, Martin Plantation. And although their blood stained the floors forever, the McGavicks were actually lucky. Their home sustained no major damage. Our poor army made one last attempt to liberate Nashville. They actually became involved in a skirmish on the front lawn of our home. I remember standing out on the porch, waving my hanky to those boys, cheering them on. Then Colonel Bleecker rode up and ordered me into the house. Said it was no longer safe for me to be standing where I was. Bullets were flying fast and furious about me. Well, of course I ignored him, stayed right there until the last of the soldiers rode off. And as I turned to go into the house, I looked up at the columns, saw the bullet holes. Bullet holes that are still there today. If you have some time, I'd like you to go over to Belmead, take a look around, perhaps check on my home for me. Make sure everything's as it should be. And when you see the bullet holes on the columns, I hope you'll remember me. Thank you. Have a good night. Okay.
Well, good evening, folks. I'm Private John Daniels of Carrollton, Mississippi. I was born on February 14, 1832, near Marietta, North Carolina. I grew up on a small farm there and attended the local schoolhouse with my brothers and sisters. But my greatest pleasure was hunting and fishing. Why, I thought nothing could make me happier than that. I was wrong. The happiest day of my life was June 6, 1858. That's the day I married my beautiful wife, Caroline Grayton. She was 22 years old and I was 26. People said we made a handsome couple. We lived with my folks until the fall of 1858, and then we moved to Mississippi to some of the new lands opening up out there. We bought some land near Duck Hill, Mississippi, and the following spring, our first daughter was born. We named her Sella Catherine after Caroline's mother. Our second daughter, Mary Louisa, was born in May 26, 1861, shortly after the war started. I knew I had to enlist to protect my family. So, after securing the summer crop and paying off my debts, I said a sad goodbye to Caroline and the girls. And on August 1st, 1862, I enlisted in the Company E of the 15th Mississippi Infantry at Jackson, Mississippi. There was a lot of sickness in the camps, and I caught a fever and was sent home in September of 1862 to recover. Being at home was wonderful. I recovered quickly, and while I was home, I was treated to get to witness the birth of our third beautiful daughter. We named her Johnny. Being at home was so wonderful that I hesitated to leave and come back. But it was my duty, and Caroline never let me forget that. I could tell you of the many bloody battles I fought in, and the thousands of deaths that I witnessed. But words alone cannot portray the horror of war, the sacrifice and suffering and waste. Many times I feared that I too would end up in some distant state, in an unmarked and unknown grave, so far from my family that they would never know of my death or burial. After the Atlanta campaign, the Army turned and marched back north up into Tennessee. I didn't know it at the time, but as we crossed the Tennessee River on our march towards Franklin, my daughter, Mary Louise, had died on November 17, 1864, my wife's birthday. What a terrible, terrible tragedy to befall any mother, to have her daughter die on her very own birthday. The fighting at the Battle of Franklin was the worst I had ever been engaged in. Our brigade was in reserve behind General Featherston's brigade. General Featherston's men advanced towards the Federal works, but they encountered an obstacle of Osage orange branches in a thick hedge about 30 feet out from the Federal works. As they attempted to pass through this hedge, the Federals raised up and poured a murderous fire into the ranks. The front line seemed to melt away before our eyes. The sight of these brave men being cut down by the scores was too much for us, and without orders, we raised that terrible rebel yell and surged forward against the works. General Adams, trying to maintain order in the ranks, shouted, "Steady, boys, hold the line!" But even he couldn't hold us back. We were itching for a fight. That brave General Adams, who we admired and respected so much, fell atop the Federal works, trying to lead us over, shot 9 times. On our second assault against the works, I felt a terrible blow against my right arm and dropped my rifle. I had been severely wounded in the lower right forearm and could no longer even carry my gun. The field surgeon did what he could for me, but it wasn't much. The pain was terrible. I lay in a temporary hospital there in Franklin until December, when the Federals captured me after our army pulled out of Nashville. The Federals moved me and hundreds of other prisoners back to hospitals up in Nashville. And that's where I caught the smallpox. Kept my wound from healing properly. Oh, those doctors didn't give me much of a chance. They said it was hopeless. And on April 1st, 1865, just 8 days before General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, I died. My worst fears had come true. My dear Caroline was left a widow. With 2 small children to raise, she never knew of my death, nor of my burial in an unmarked, unknown grave. But before I died, I had the strangest dream that brought me great comfort. As I lay in that hospital bed, amidst all that suffering, I saw my daughter, Mary Louise. She was so beautiful. She stretched out her arms to me. She said in the sweetest voice, "Welcome home."
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vernon King Stevenson, and this is my 4th wife, Anna. My first 3 wives died, and I'm a living example that practice makes perfect.
Mr. Stevenson, I believe this is the most company we've had in a long time. Not since we lived over on Spring Street. It's just right over that way, just up from the river, and I believe it's called Church Street today. But Mr. Stevenson, I don't believe they recognize you.
Well, they do look a little confused, but they'll recognize my railroad than Nashville and Chattanooga. 150 years ago, we worked hard to build that railroad, and I'll bet most of you believe what you read in those history books about all the railroads being up north. Well, let me tell you, the first chartered railroad in the United States was called the Best Friend of Charleston in 1835, down in South Carolina. My railroad was chartered in 1845, a year before the Pennsylvania Railroad. We never liked Yankees, we never hired any. And when we needed money, we didn't go to northern banks, we sold bonds from Baring Brothers in London, England.
Mr. Stevenson, I think you ought to tell these people just how difficult it was to build that line.
Well, if any of you have ever been from Nashville to Chattanooga, you know how high the Cumberland Plateau can be. Well, we knew we weren't going to be able to build a train that would go 900, 1,000 feet up that bank, so we decided to dig a hole through the mountain. Over at Cowan, Tennessee, we dug the tunnel. Finally finished it in 1852, and a year later, the trains were running.
Those trains are still running today.
That's right. You know, the point of it all was to load produce and goods here in Tennessee, be able to ship them by train straight through Chattanooga to Atlanta. Now, Atlanta was a miserable little railroad junction called Marthasville, but they had the Western and Atlantic Railroad. And that railroad went straight to Charleston. And Charleston was a port you could sell to Europe. Well, this infuriated the northern manufacturers. And the northern manufacturers outnumbered us in Congress. They kept passing laws, raising the tariffs, raising the taxes on everything we did with Europe. It wasn't long before the South was paying almost all the taxes that the United States was collecting. And they were spending those taxes on canals and roads all over the North. It's not such a surprise to realize why the states in the deep South, from South Carolina all the way to Texas, voted secession. Now here in Tennessee, we didn't vote secession. Not until the President of the United States declared a war on the states, then opinions started to change.
I certainly know the opinions for we ladies started to change, especially when we heard about General Winfield Scott's wife.
Miss Wendy Scott, a sweet woman from Washington, D.C.
That's right. She was quoted as saying that Lincoln was one of those fellows that recently would be around corner stores whittling and telling stories just as funny as they were vulgar. We couldn't even believe that the Yankees would vote for that type of man.
Well, Governor Harris of Tennessee was disgusted. He said that was an alarming and dangerous policy of usurpation of power by the President of the United States to precipitate a war between sovereign states of America. He said that Tennessee was not to send one single man for coercion.
I know I certainly was proud to be a Tennessean. Governor Harris, he made my Mr. Stevenson the quartermaster for the Army of Tennessee. He worked night and day to get supplies for the Army. But unfortunately, here in Nashville, we were very naive. We had no idea that the Yankees would even get close to Nashville. Suddenly, Fort Donelson falls. Then, the next thing we hear, the Yankee Navy is coming up the Cumberland River. We are in a panic. Nashville has not prepared. We think they are going to be here and they are going to burn and destroy this city. So Mr. Stevenson, he loads up our belongings and sends us on to Chattanooga.
Well, I did have a railroad. You'd have done the same thing. But it was soon when the Army of Tennessee struck back. We hit them at Shiloh. We surprised the Federal Army. We pushed them almost back into the Tennessee River when all of a sudden our commanding general, General Albert Sidney Johnston, was shot. As he came back from the attack, he slid off his horse into the arms of Governor Harris. Governor Harris and I looked all over him for the wound. He was dying. We found that he had been shot right through the cavalry boot, The bullet severed the artery that fed that leg, and he bled to death in his boot almost before we could even find the wound. It was tragic. I spent most of the rest of the war in Georgia, keeping the trains running. I'd run our trains as close to Nashville as ever the Army of Tennessee was. I must say, though, that while in Georgia, I did get a few bales of cotton off to Europe and made a small fortune. It was after the war, when there was no money in the South, not really enough to keep the trains running. That's when Anna and I moved to New York City, where we had a real estate business and made enough money to keep the trains going. It was in New York City in 1884 when I died, leaving Anna a wealthy widow.
Wealthy I was. He left me over $5 million. But as you can see, I brought Mr. Stevenson back here to be buried, and his tomb is a copy of Napoleon's. We had been personal friends of Napoleon III's, and we had been to Paris on numerous occasions, where Mr. Stevenson had remarked how he liked the monument. So I thought it only fitting that he should have something as grand over his final resting place.
She shouldn't have done it.
But, ladies and gentlemen, the next time you happen to hear a train whistle blowing off to the east, or you happen to see a train going to Chattanooga, please remember us.
And thank you all for coming by this evening.
Good evening, brothers and sisters. How y'all doing tonight? Cold, okay. We get used to that up here. I'm Captain Thomas Ryman, and I'm pleased to learn that the great tabernacle I built still stands in downtown Nashville. Of course, you all know it as the Ryman Auditorium. Now, I designed my own tombstone here, and it nearly tells my life story. On this side, there's a fishing boat with a net, and on this side over here, there's a steamboat. Well, let me tell you how one led to the other. I was born here in 1841, and as you probably know, in those days, rivers were the primary means of transportation. And Nashville probably wouldn't be here were it not for the Cumberland River. Now, the river provided us with our living through fishing, and also you may be surprised to learn that we also sold ice in the summertime. Well, my father and I would cut the ice, pile it on flatboats. We'd moor the flatboats in the shade of the bluffs so that it would freeze solid, and then we'd cut the ice into blocks and store them in underground caves until summertime. If you remember this last summer we had, you can imagine the kind of profit we made on that. Now, speaking of profit, I understand you all are talking about an income tax. Well, we didn't have an income tax in those days, and I am not for an income tax. But we Southerners provided a lot of the revenue that was raised by the federal government through tariffs on our exported goods. We traded heavily with the Europeans, and northern manufacturers grew jealous. In 1860, I still believe that if John Bell had been elected, you met him earlier this evening, that we might have worked out our differences with the North. But they elected Abraham Lincoln, who represented the interests of the northern manufacturers. And when our fellow southern states began leaving the Union after Lincoln's election, we Tennesseans voted against secession. And it was only when the federal government demanded we provide troops to invade and subdue our neighbors and kin, and we grew outraged and joined the new Confederacy. I did very well selling fish to the Confederate Army for a time, and then the Yankees captured me and took me prisoner, put me in jail. Fortunately, a pardon was arranged, and I was not in prison very long. I was able to come home. Now, unlike Mrs. Ackland, whom you all met earlier, most of us Southerners were financially ruined at the end of the war. But I worked hard. In a few years, I was able to save $3,000, which was a lot of money in those times. I built a raft out of logs, covered it with a brush arbor, and floated it down the Mississippi River all the way to New Orleans. There I bought an old steamboat. Well, that was the beginning of my fleet, the Ryman line. And we operated steam packets from Burnside, Kentucky, all the way to Evansville, Indiana, which is a total distance of about 700 miles. It was a very profitable enterprise, and at the time of my death, I was owner or partner in over 30 boats. Now, also at the end of the war came expansion of the railroads. We started losing a lot of business to the competition. In order to prove how fast we were, the steamboat companies started holding races. Now, you may have heard about the big race between the Natchez and the Robert E. Lee over on the Mississippi River. But have you ever heard about the race between the Will Cummins and the Dunbar on the Cumberland River? Well, the Dunbar was my boat. I was captain of her. And what an exciting race that was. Boats would pass, passengers would cheer, people lined up on the wharves and the levees, cheering us as we went by. And though I was accused of excess steam pressure, I'm proud to say the Dunbar won that race. In 1885, I experienced a religious conversion at a tent revival here in Nashville. Along with my new faith, I undertook the construction of an interdenominational tabernacle so that all my fellow Nashvillians could worship the Holy Spirit as I did. It was completed in 1892, and I named it the Union Gospel Tabernacle. And many's the revival that was held there. Upon my death in 1904, it was renamed the Ryman Auditorium at the suggestion of my good friend, Reverend Sam Jones. I was only 65 then, but I had really accomplished about all one could hope for. I've got to get back to the revival now, but the next time you all go downtown to a show or a theater production, I hope you might see my statue and remember old Tom Ryman. Have a good night. I'm going down the river of
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen. Brigadier General William Nelson Rector Bill at your service. It is my honor tonight to be able to share with you a little bit about my life and my military service. But I do feel obligated to point out that I am not Daniel F. Carter. This gentleman was just kind enough to allow me to use his abode for the evening. Actually, I'm buried off that way some distance near where Generals Cheatham and Massey are buried alongside my wife Felicia. I'm a native of Bardstown, Kentucky, where I was born in 1825, but before my 10th birthday my family moved to the Arkansas Territory, and as a result I've always rather considered that state to be my home. In 1844 I received an appointment to West Point, where I graduated 4 years later with a commission as a second lieutenant of infantry. My first posting was in the Northwest Territory. I served on our country's west coast until 1855, when I requested and received a transfer to the cavalry. Over the next 6 years, I gained valuable combat experience tussling with the Comanche, who were considered some of the best light infantry in the world at that time. Now, they were fierce warriors, fearless. They rode into battle full tilt, screaming like demons in hopes of terrifying their opponents into running. Well, I bring up that fact to lead into the fact that we made it as far south in our chasing them, as far south as Texas. And I had the honor to see Texas Rangers ride into battle, full tilt, screaming like demons in response. And it is my firm belief that this is the source of the rebel yell that was made famous a few years later. In any case, I was still serving in the Indian Territory when, like Tennessee here, Arkansas refused Lincoln's call for troops to invade the Deep South and instead voted to secede and join the Confederacy themselves. Well, in late summer of 1861, therefore, I left my post out west and returned home to Arkansas, where I enlisted in the Confederate Army and was allowed to retain the same rank that I last held in the Union Army, which was captain of cavalry. I saw my first service there in Arkansas under General Van Dorn and attempted to put to use my experience fighting Comanches trying to run the Yankees out of Arkansas. Now, twice he recommended my promotion to colonel. And finally, in April of 1862, the Confederate Congress saw fit to act on his recommendation, but rather than colonel, they promoted me to brigadier general, for which I was everlastingly grateful. 2 weeks later, I was given command of all the mounted troops under General Beauregard at Corinth, Mississippi, but did not hold that post long before being transferred to Port Hudson, Louisiana, in order to shore up the defenses there. Now, Port Hudson was on a bluff 80 feet above the Mississippi River, and along with Vicksburg, Mississippi, these were our two keys to holding control, maintaining control of the Mississippi River. and the Mississippi was a vital lifeline of the Confederacy. With the next spring, the year 1863, they saw fit to send us a new commanding officer, Major General Franklin Gardner. Now, Franklin Gardner was a native of New York City and the son of a staunch Unionist. But on a trip south, he had met and married a daughter of a staunch secessionist. So when the war finally broke out, he decided to cast his lot with the Confederacy and his wife rather than the Union and his father. But despite his birth, his devotion to our cause was beyond question, and he was an able commander and became a good friend. Despite the fact that most of our boys had seen very little combat, he was able to instill in them a fierce determination and an iron discipline. And that came in handy when the Yankee Navy began to bombard our position over the next several weeks, trying to knock us off our perch, but we would not be budged. So finally, in May of 1863, they brought in 30,000 Federal infantry to surround the 7,000 of us at Port Hudson, cutting off our reinforcements and any hope of resupply. Now, soon after that, they launched a full-scale assault up and down our line with white and black troops. Now, this was the first time, or one of the first times in the war, that black soldiers had participated, and their papers claim that these black soldiers planted their colors on our parapets amidst the 38th Mississippi, and then proceeded to tear the flesh off the arms of our boys with their teeth. Now, point of fact, no Yankee soldier, black or white, reached within 200 yards of our lines. The 38th Mississippi suffered no casualties, and instead the Yankees were stopped and forced to retreat, leaving 2,000 dead and wounded on the field. Now, a month later, in June, they attempted a second assault, this time concentrating their forces on the center of our lines, where I was in command. But when they came charging out of the magnolia forests there, we shredded their assault, and they left 1,800 on the field dead to our 47. Now, over the next few weeks, they lost another 4,000 men to disease and sunstroke. The Louisiana heat and swamps can be a harsh mistress to an ill-prepared Yankee. Now, despite of our successes and the fact that their combined forces, Army and Navy, had been unable to breach our lines, you cannot expect a starving man to keep on fighting forever. Now, General Gardner, he kept our morale up by being the first to smoke a magnolia leaf cigar. Now, that is a tough smoke, let me tell you. Soon thereafter, he became the first one of us to try eating a mule steak. That's even tougher. So finally, even these supplies ran out, and finally in July of 1863, starvation forced us to surrender. But even then, General Gardner refused to surrender until the Yankees could prove to him beyond a doubt that Pemberton had already surrendered Vicksburg, which he had on July 4th. Well, the day we surrendered, we were supposed to march out of our lines, leaving our guns behind, but half of our men were so weak that they couldn't even stand any longer, and the Yankees instead had to carry them out on stretchers. Now, I was sent to a camp in Boston Harbor, and by that winter, our boys were dying by the dozens every day in those cold northern camps. I can't even begin to tell you the horrors of places like Elmira, New York, and Fort Johnson and Lake Erie, or the plight of our boys who were captured at winter battles like here in Nashville. Many of the boys didn't even have shoes or overcoats and were shipped north on unheated boxcars. It's a miracle that any of those boys were able to survive. Now, the Yankees, they will complain vociferously about the number of their prisoners that died in southern camps, but it is a fact that more Southerners died in Yankee camps than Yankees died in Southern camps. And in my mind, it is to their everlasting shame that they had the supplies and the food to care for our boys being held prisoner and chose to withhold those supplies, whereas their own blockade had wrung us dry, and we didn't even have the equipment or material to supply our own troops, let alone take care of their men properly that we held as prisoners. And the fact that the prison camps were even in existence that late in the war were due to General Grant closing off the exchange program and refusing to accept any more prisoners in exchange. We even at one point the last winter collected sick and wounded prisoners and tried to release them without asking any of our boys to be released, and they refused to accept those prisoners, and we had no choice but to take them home and watch them die in the camps. Now, President Davis, in an attempt to relieve the suffering, arranged for my release in 1864 and appointed me a Confederate agent to attempt to supply our prisoners being held in the camps up north. So the Yankees allowed me to open an office in New York City near Wall Street, and the ships that I designated were allowed to pass through the federal blockade loaded with Southern cotton, which I then sold at a brokerage firm there in New York, using the proceeds to buy food and clothing and blankets for our prisoners being held up north. Now, I continued at this work long after the war ended until nearly all of our boys were finally released, allowed to go home myself finally in August of 1865. My military career was now at an end, of course, and so I spent the last years of my life until my death in July of 1883 working as a commissioned merchant. I had offices in St. Louis, Missouri, and south of here in McMinnville, Tennessee. Now, I was trained as a soldier, and I'm proud of my service in the Union Army and in the Confederate Army. But what I am proud most of in my life is the work that I did in New York City, bringing some comfort at least to our boys being held captive. I appreciate your kind attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.